I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm afraid it doesn't have a very happy ending. We've had a lot of positivity this morning. I'm going to bring it down a notch. In the early 2000s, the UK government wanted to roll out a new farming subsidy. In the past, farmers had been paid based on how much they produced, and under the new system, they'd be paid based on how much land they farmed. This was an EU-wide change. And the UK was keen to be on the front foot with this. It wanted to roll out this new subsidy within 9 months. But 1 year on, things had gone disastrously wrong. Only a small fraction of the subsidy had been handed out. Farmers were extremely stressed. There were huge delays. Some of them were going into debt and even going bankrupt. By 2012, when things had finally calmed down, the UK had ended up spending hundreds of millions of pounds in unforeseen costs. And far from being the first in Europe to roll out this new subsidy, we ended up being fined by the EU for being so delayed. So what had happened? What went wrong? Well, I like to sum it up. Oh, I can't click. Oh, sorry. There we go. I'd like to sum it up in these 2 words: bad data. So the problem was that a lot of land was at that time not registered. So the government didn't actually have an accurate record of who owned land or who they were and where that land was. So a lot more people came forward to claim this new subsidy than they'd been expecting, and it led to huge delays and a huge backlog in the system. And although that then did lead to a lot of land being registered, to this day, there's still 15% of the land in England which remains unregistered. So we officially don't know who it belongs to. And I'm going to talk to you today about problems like this, about how often, despite the best of intentions, government decisions and policies can have unintended consequences because they're based on bad data. Governments want to use data, and I'm talking here mainly about numerical data. They want to base their decisions on hard evidence because government ministers and politicians, like all of the rest of us, tend to think of numbers as a very solid and reliable form of evidence, perhaps even something objective and independent. In the past, governments could get away with just making decisions on the basis of ideology or theory, or simply because I say so. But they can't really do that nowadays. Generally, they're now expected to justify policies using some kind of figures. They're expected to show empirical proof that they're improving people's lives and making things better. This is the idea of evidence-based policymaking, and of course, that's a good thing. But there's something very important that we have to bear in mind, and that is that not all data is reliable or accurate. And you might be thinking, well, yes, that's an obvious statement to make. We all know that. But it's not as straightforward as you might think, especially for politicians and ministers, to judge whether data is really accurate. And governments are getting tripped up by this all the time. So I work at the House of Commons Library, which is the research service to the UK Parliament. So I'm part of a team of statisticians who provide data, stats, to all 650 members of the UK Parliament and their staff. So we're for all political parties and we're non-partisan. So politicians operate in a very fast-paced environment, having to get to grips with a wide variety of topics from one day to the next. And this comes with a huge demand for data. On any given day, we might get asked questions like, how many children in my constituency live in poverty? Or kind of macroeconomic questions even, like, well, how's the global economy doing? Or even questions really down to the local level, like, how many people in the UK keep chickens in their back garden. And in this job, I've been surprised to find that while we do have good data on many things, there are lots of very important policy areas, such as immigration, crime, poverty, and inequality, where even our official data is poor quality or non-existent. And the problem is that even if the data that exists is flawed, it's still going to be used to make important decisions. I can explain at length to an MP or to their staff why even some of our official data sets can't be used to say things with certainty. But such is the need and the desire to use data that this is like giving a hungry person food and then telling them that it's past its use-by date. If they're hungry enough, they're still going to eat it. And so I started collecting examples of things going wrong because policies or decisions were based on bad data, and I've compiled them in this book. And you can think of them maybe as cautionary tales. For years, in the UK, our immigration statistics were pretty much completely inaccurate, and no one realized. At the time, we were estimating migration using a passenger questionnaire at airports. And the idea was to take a sample of people coming in and out of the country and to use that to say something about the overall scale of migration. And it was actually working pretty well until the early to mid-2000s when migration patterns changed completely. It was the era of new budget airlines and also the expansion of the EU to include 8 new countries. And people started arriving in the UK at airports that hadn't really been used much in the past for large-scale traffic. And this passenger questionnaire wasn't even being done at some of these airports, which became really popular. So our statisticians missed hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country, perhaps even millions of them, from their sampling. And our official immigration figures were inaccurate for years. It was the 2010s by that point, and the discovery that we had failed to count immigration fed into the growing narrative that immigration itself was out of control. We're still trying to fill in the blanks as to what actually happened to migration to the UK over the last 20 years. And there have been other policy areas where a lack of data has led to problems. When the UK state pension was first introduced, and this was over 100 years ago now, a lot more people came forward to claim it than they'd been expecting. It was a bit of a similar story to that farming subsidy that I mentioned. And why did more people come forward than they'd expected? Well, because the government at that time didn't actually have data on people's age. They didn't know how many people were pension age because birth registration had only been made compulsory a few decades earlier. Some people themselves didn't even know their own age. They just thought, well, I feel like a pension now, so I'll come forward. Nowadays, we do a good job of counting births and deaths and lots of basic things like that. But there are policy debates that have been going on for years because we just don't have the data to settle them, like whether selective schools are beneficial for society, whether prison works, or whether requiring photo ID deters people from voting. We don't know the answers to these questions, which are being actively discussed, because the data either hasn't been collected or it can't yet tell us anything definitive. And some things are inherently hard to count and measure because they lack a fixed definition. And this is a universal issue. Every government has to contend with it. And it's often things which are socially important which are the hardest to define and measure. Categories like disabled or in poverty are not fixed. And there are some societal problems that we can all agree exist without being able to unanimously define what they are. There are no obvious cutoff points between being in and out of poverty, disabled or not, that we can all agree on. And this is an issue that comes up a lot when trying to measure aspects of well-being, as many of you are more than aware. And let's look for a moment at how we measure poverty. There is obviously no single way of measuring it nowadays, but that can make it tricky, actually, to say whether it has gone up or down, or rather become better or worse, from one year to the next, let alone to compare it across countries or over a very long time period. You can look at absolute poverty and relative poverty, and they might tell you something different as to whether conditions are really improving or not. When governments want to measure well-being, they often nowadays think of it as something multidimensional. But this is actually not really anything new. This is pretty pixelated, but it's a map of Victorian-era London, so in the 19th century. And social reformers and researchers at that time were starting to try and quantify the conditions of the poor, which everyone acknowledged were pretty bad, but they just couldn't say how bad. So these color-coded maps were an attempt to try and capture the living standards of households based on a variety of factors, including income, crowding, housing conditions, and also people's social class. And it wasn't very systematic, it has to be said. It mostly consisted of researchers walking around with local police officers and having them point out the less desirable households. But it's not really such a far cry from an indicator that the UK's Office for National Statistics uses nowadays, called the Deprivation Index. Areas are scored on a variety of different dimensions, including income poverty, health and education outcomes, also environmental factors of a local area. But it can result in peculiarities as well. There's an area in central London around the Savoy Hotel, which is one of the most expensive, and the London School of Economics, and an area where flats cost upwards of £1 million. And it ranks in the second most deprived category. Why? Because it scores very badly on air pollution and petty crime. It is subjective and specific to culture and time and place what is considered important to record. And another way of triangulating where people are happiest is simply to ask them. The World Happiness Report is an annual exercise to poll people around the world and ask them about their satisfaction with life. And the Nordic countries always come out on top. But we have to be cautious about comparing self-reported happiness across countries and cultures. The Erasmus University in Rotterdam also came up with a world database of happiness, and it found that Malawi was the happiest country in Africa, despite an estimated 3/4 of the population living in poverty. In fact, Malawi was much happier than Cameroon, which had the lowest poverty rate on the continent. So should we look again at the material evidence of poverty and deprivation when confronted with evidence like that? Probably not, because it might also be the case that people in Malawi simply answer questions about happiness differently to people in Cameroon. And would that be surprising? No. It's very culturally specific, the extent to which people will voice feelings of unhappiness and discomfort, and the way that they reflect on the conditions in which they live. The UK's Office for National Statistics also came up with their own happiness index, and they named Ribble Valley as the happiest place in the UK, and that's in the northwest of England. Local residents there were apparently not surprised that they'd been named the happiest, and they came up with lots of explanations as to why it might be, which even included how good the pub food was. But strangely, the second unhappiest place was South Ribble, which is directly next to Ribble Valley. Living conditions in both places were essentially the same. The results really just seemed a bit random. So no indicator of well-being is going to be perfect, is it? We should be wary of taking data at face value when it concerns things which are in some way subjective. This might not matter too much for things like happiness surveys. Those aren't generally being used to design policy. But the UK's deprivation index, the one that labels areas with £1 million flats as deprived, is used to set school funding and to prioritise healthcare planning. It's quite straightforward how we should measure basic things like births and deaths. The only barriers are resources and political will. But reality isn't always as tidy as we want it to be. When it comes to counting and measuring concepts or states like well-being, we have to remember that the data is always going to be a work in progress. Now, data can be flawed and it can mess up public policy. What are we supposed to do with this realization? Well, first of all, looking more closely at where data actually comes from can help us set the right expectations for how it can be a useful partner in decision-making. I've been talking here mainly about the UK, but many governments, local and national, face enormous challenges when it comes to data. And the UK is actually pretty good by global standards, despite me having criticised it for the last 20 minutes. According to UNICEF, 1 in 5 children in the world today doesn't exist, on paper at least, in the sense that their birth was never registered. In Ethiopia, this is thought to be the case for up to 3/4 of children under 5. If we don't even have basic population data, we're a world away from letting data really do the driving of public policy, aren't we? There's a huge data divide between countries, and we see that in their ability to monitor progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Until 2022, the Democratic Republic of Congo hadn't done a traditional census since the 1980s because the conditions there had just been too challenging to carry one out. So data on people living in that country is very piecemeal, and that makes it hard to monitor progress towards the SDGs. But Denmark, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, also hasn't done a traditional census since, I think, the 1970s. But that's because they don't have to. They've got such a complete population register that on any given day, they can tell you quite reliably some basic information about the population. And what we can also do is to equip ourselves against bad data, is to look for the human element. Numbers don't count themselves, people do. Behind seemingly solid statistics, there are people scrambling to try and count and measure things in a world where populations are constantly on the go and change is pretty much the norm. And we have to remember that ultimately it's people who have decision-making power. Data can help us make sense of the world. It can be a valuable or even essential resource for public policy, but it has its limits. Thank you.